island hopping in Croatia, underrated wine, and dirty macaroni. This week, we're in Croatia and Montenegro.
Traveling the world to bring you delicious dishes, tasty beverages, and interesting experiences. This is the Destination Eat Drink Podcast on the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
I'm Brent Peterson. Welcome to Destination Eat Drink, the travel podcast for foodies. This is where we explore the food of the world at the Destination Eat Drink podcast and destinationeatdrink.com. This week, my guest is travel writer for Rick Steves Europe, Cameron Hewitt. But before we get to Cameron, would you support our Destination Eat Drink project? It's super easy, and it's only a couple bucks. Just go to destinationeatdrink.com and click on the contribute button, and thank you very much. Cameron Hewitt has worked for Rick Steves Europe as a guidebook writer for the better part of 2 decades. He spends 3 or 4 months every year traveling to Europe, updating guidebooks, and discovering new, interesting places, things to do, and food to try. Cameron tells me about returning to Europe for the first time in 2 years and reclaiming his love of travel, mourning the loss of some of his favorite spots, and island hopping in Croatia. We talk about Croatian food and wine, and then take a trip to Montenegro's Bay of Kotor. Plus, Cameron shares what happens when you become a tabloid headline in Scotland. Okay, I'm starving, so let's eat.
Destination Eat Drink.
Cameron Hewitt, welcome back to Destination Eat Drink. It's great to have you back on the podcast.
Thanks for having me back, Brent. It's great to talk with you.
You just got back from another whirlwind trip to Europe. I guess I shouldn't phrase it that way. It makes it sound like this is something unusual. You spend a lot of time traveling, updating guidebooks, doing research and whatnot. But this was really the first summer when travel was trying to get back to, and I'm using air quotes here, normal. What are your takeaways or observations about what travel is like now? Has it changed at all? Is it different in any way?
Yeah, it's interesting being back at it. I was, for almost 2 full years, I couldn't travel like a lot of us during the pandemic. So this year, I've already traveled more than 4 months to Europe. That's even more than my usual rate. So I had a trip in the spring, February and March for about 5 weeks. Then in the summer, May and June, it was another, 6 weeks. And then I just got back from another 6 or 7 weeks in Croatia, Slovenia, Bosnia, and Switzerland. And it's kind of been interesting to see how things have changed over the course of the year, even because this was a year of tremendous change. I said early in the year when I was beginning my travels to people who would ask, like the theme this year is expect the unexpected, be flexible.
Right.
So, I mean, in the spring, I think things were slower to get back to normal than people might have hoped for 2 reasons. One was the Omicron variant kind of cropped up around the holidays, and it caused a lot of people who were maybe going to go earlier in the year to postpone or to think twice. And then you had, of course, the invasion of Ukraine in February as well. And I think there, especially for Eastern Europe, that was kind of a damper on people who were planning on getting back to travel. And then, it was really interesting. I was in Rome and London in March, just as museums were literally opening up after being closed for a couple of years, and they were still figuring it out. And I guess I would say over the course of the year, it's amazing to me how much, things did get, quote, back to normal. It felt in February and March like things were still very tentative. By the time I got back in May and June, everyone was kind of in full swing. And by the time I went back in September and October, people were just exhausted. I mean, everyone I talked to was like, hey, this has been a great year. It's such a relief and so satisfying to get back to what we love doing. But number one, it was a weird year. There was just a lot of strange, mainly COVID related, but not exclusively COVID related things that kind of made it a tough year, challenging year. And, we're also not used to this, after not either whether you work in tourism in Europe or whether you're a traveler like me, 2 years of not doing your normal thing. It was harder to do everything. And so I think the theme I found late in the year was, man, we need a break. We need this winter to catch our breath. But I think the good news for travelers is, especially by mid-year and let it later half of the year, things feel very much back to normal. And, I was in Croatia here at the end, my last part of my trip in September and October. And Croatia actually opened up a little bit for tourism, even in late 2020 and 2021. They didn't have a lot of Americans, but they had a close to a normal season, mainly of European travelers. And so I would ask people in Croatia, like, oh, how are things going since the pandemic? And for them, they're like, what are you talking about? That was 2 years ago, whereas other parts of Europe,
Okay.
I could tell there was a lot of reentry kind of headaches. But in Croatia, they're already kind of getting burned out again on all the travelers.
As you know, we're based in Portugal. We live in Portugal now. And we made a trip in the spring to Ireland, and it was fantastic. We had a great time. We saw some friends from Chicago. It was a blast. But strictly because of the airline situation, we vowed that we were not going to fly anymore for the rest of this year. And, it's been kind of a blessing because we've got this whole country of Portugal that we can visit by train and by bus and whatever, and we can explore our own backyard. But we said, look, until this airline thing gets figured out, and we were traveling that weekend, I don't know if you saw it, but they had the European Cup final, and people were stuck for hours and hours in airports. There were lines that were literally out the airport and down. And, people were waiting to go through security for 8 hours or more. And we said, you know what, we can't do this until they get it figured out. And what I hear you saying, Cameron, is they kind of got it figured out at this point.
I would say the airport chaos, especially that peaked over the summer, was maybe the hardest thing in some ways. Especially COVID restrictions kind of were drawn down early in the year, like late spring, early summer. I still wore a mask just out of an abundance of caution when I was on a train or a plane. But, by summer and fall, you didn't have to test, for example, to fly home to the U.S., this sort of thing. But yeah, the thing I heard about a lot in terms of major headaches, I mentioned earlier, some of the difficulties this year were COVID related, others not. I think the airline stuff was probably a little of both. I think that the airports were really short staffed because still after the pandemic, as with everywhere, staffing levels are not what they could be. I got very lucky. I flew over and back 3 times this year and took some internal flights. And the worst that happened to me was, my wife flew with me to Switzerland and our bag got delayed coming in from Amsterdam. And we just had it delivered to our hotel later that night, so we got very lucky. But I know exactly what you're talking about. There was a lot of stories of long lines at airports, people missing connections, bags missing connections. When we did fly through Amsterdam on that trip, I remember we were taxiing at the Amsterdam airport. And I looked out the window and I saw the terminal building off in the distance, and I saw a long line of people arriving to check in for their flight stretching outside of the terminal building. This was early September. And I thought, well, I guess I'm glad we're changing planes here, not originating here.
I've heard a lot of people. Amsterdam was one of the major choke points this summer. A lot of our friends trying to go through Amsterdam were just like, oh, can't do it, never again, or at least until things get better.
Well, and if you don't mind, Brent, I'll just add, I'm really determined to be optimistic this year, especially.
Fair enough.
Maybe I'm being a bit of a Pollyanna. But when I do hear about a lot of airport problems, but you don't hear about people's trips that go smoothly. And I think there's no doubt that there were more problems than usual this year. But I kind of, people asked me when I was planning the September trip, are you sure you want to go back to Europe with that possibility looming? And it's kind of like, it's a crapshoot. It's always a crapshoot. I've had travels during perfect times when I missed a connection or my flight got canceled and I got stuck somewhere overnight. That can happen anytime. It was more likely to happen at this stage, but with all the traveling I did, I kept thinking that every time I had a connection that went perfectly according to schedule, I thought, well, no one's going to hear about this connection. They're going to hear about the ones that got blown up. So, it wasn't impossible to travel this year, although I absolutely understand people's concern about it. I also think everyone needs to have a realistic understanding of their own threshold for uncertainty. And so what I started saying early in the year to my followers on Facebook and the people we talk through Rick Steves Europe is, if you have a very low threshold for, dealing with situations that go sideways, this is probably not a year that you want to be traveling a lot. But if you're willing to kind of roll with it, it was certainly still a very rewarding year to travel.
Excellent points all, Cameron. So you go to Europe mostly for work. 95% of what you're doing is work related, and you're updating guidebooks. And, during this COVID time, it was a very difficult time for folks. You said you hadn't been back in a couple of years. And one thing I wanted to ask you about was some of these places that closed down during COVID, they did not reopen. They closed forever. And when one of my favorite places closes down, I'm thinking of a place in Dublin specifically, but there's lots of places that I love that have closed down. I feel crushed. I feel like personally like, oh, I'm really depressed. I'm wondering, were there any of your favorite places that you went back to and you're like, oh man, I can't believe this place closed down, or I can't believe they couldn't make it through, or I'm really sad that I won't be able to visit here anymore?
Oh, absolutely. And I guess I would say in general, as you mentioned, I work with Rick Steves and we work on the best-selling guidebooks in the US. And during the pandemic, we were very concerned about all of our favorite we describe them as kind of our little mom and pop businesses, because a lot of the places we put in our guidebooks are not big, corporate owned things. They're a family that runs a hotel or a restaurant. And we felt like those people were potentially very vulnerable to all this. So the good news is, he and I both have traveled a lot this year, and we found that vast majority of our favorite places are still standing. So we were, first of all, just totally relieved about that. We thought we might have to go in and, take out tons and tons of our guidebook listings. And we found, most of the good places, the reason we had them in the book is because they're good. And the ones that were good generally survived pretty well. There is one I'm thinking of, though, that was a real disappointment in Mostar, the city in the southern part of Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's a very popular day trip destination from the Dalmatian coast in Croatia. There was a wonderful, like a microbrew pub. I think it was called Black Dog Pub. And it was run by an American expat who I believe had come to work in the former Yugoslavia in the 1990s during the war, even, I think, right after the war, as a humanitarian relief worker, and just fell in love with the place. And he had opened this beautiful, fun, beautifully situated little microbrew pub. And one thing I loved about the place, it was just a great hangout. It was a wonderful place just to, nurse a beer and relax. But he made a point, Mostar is still somewhat of a divided city after the war. There's still a part of town that's for the Croats and a part of town that's for the Muslims or the Bosniaks. And there is a lot of mixing between the populations. But even all these years after the war, there's a lot of tensions in the community. And I remember one thing I loved about it wasn't just the experience of going there, but that he made a point to hire employees from each of the different communities in Mostar, because he wanted his pub to be kind of a symbol of reconciliation and kind of progress. And, that one hurt. He actually emailed me, I think in 2020 or even 2020, I think it was 2021, he wrote, and he said, we made it through the first year with a little help from the government and just kind of using all our savings. But we're at a point where we've realized we don't know when this is going to end and we're going to have to close down. And that was a real bummer, because I love those places that aren't just great places, but they have a great story behind them as well.
Yeah, that's disappointing. You mentioned that you came back from Croatia, from Slovenia. We talked a lot about Slovenia last time you were on the show. I want to talk a little bit about Croatia this time, because it's a place that I really love. And, one of the great things to do in Croatia, a lot of people go to Dubrovnik, but one of the great things to do in Croatia is to island hop along the Dalmatian coast there. You can do it in a day trip, or you can make a whole vacation, just going one island to the other. Talk a little bit about this kind of itinerary and your recommendation for how to enjoy these beautiful Croatian islands.
Yeah, that's a good question. It's one I get a lot. In fact, I had a coworker who's one of our travel consultants here at my office, and she had a little break. She's a tour guide also. She had a little break between her tours this fall, and she said, well, if I had 5 days to spend on Croatia's Dalmatian coast, how should I spend it? And that's a very common question. And I'd say that if you're kind of thinking about how to plan a trip there, there's kind of the two kind of poles, or the tent poles, I guess, would be the big city of Split up in the northern part of the Dalmatian coast, and of course Dubrovnik, which is sort of the tourist darling and just an incredibly beautiful city that's there at the southern end of the Dalmatian coast. So I would say if you've got 5-6 days a week in the region, you want to make sure you spend a little time in each of those towns, 1 or 2 days each, depending on how much time you've got. And then there are these really handy, direct, speedy catamarans that zip between those two cities and stop off at a couple of great islands. And the two that we have in our guidebook that are kind of the obvious choices. There's one that's further north, close to Split. It's called Hvar, Hvar, Hvar. And that's kind of the jet set destination. It's become really famous for its nightlife, and it's very expensive and kind of ritzy. And then a little farther south, a little closer to Dubrovnik, is another island called Korčula. And I guess I like Korčula a little bit better because it's a little more close to the ground. It's a little earthier. It still feels a little more like an old fishing town as opposed to a glitzy tourist destination. I used to say it was less expensive than Hvar, and it still is, but that difference has subsided a little bit. One thing I want to warn people and let people know is everyone in Croatia this year was lamenting how the prices have gone up drastically for everything, but specifically food, restaurants, and hotels. Everything's kind of gone up a lot over the last couple of years. It's really I think some people still think of Croatia as a bargain basement destination. They think it's, quote, Eastern Europe, and therefore it's a cheap place to travel. And that is just absolutely not true anymore. And if you want to eat in the old city of Split or in the old town of Dubrovnik, it's hard to find a place that has entrees for less than 20 euros, and if you find one, it might not be the best quality. So that was a big theme. But in terms of island hopping, these catamarans make it easy. And those are the obvious choices, but there's hundreds of islands in Croatia. And if you wanted to get those are both pretty well on the beaten path. So if you wanted to get farther off the beaten path, there's several other smaller islands that take a little more effort to get to, but it would help you get away from some of the crowds.
Speaking of these islands, there's an island called Pag, P-A-G, that I actually haven't been to, but I love the cheese from there. There's a special cheese, a sheep's milk cheese, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it's called Pashki sir. Pashki is the adjective form of Pag, so it's Pashki sir, Pag cheese.
And it's delicious because those sheep are out grazing on, salt grass from the this grass that's growing near the Adriatic Sea, and the cheese is absolutely exquisite. I would imagine that going there and having some of the cheese would be a real great experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's fun because each island has its own sort of claims to fame. So that's part of the fun of traveling place to place. And it's interesting because pug cheese has always been, even years ago, that was recognized as sort of a great kind of Croatia-wide specialty. But one thing I've noticed more recently is this sort of foodie sensibility is becoming a little more appreciated and understood among the people of Croatia. And so, whereas you used to go to a restaurant in a place like Korčula, and it would just be a generic menu of pasta dishes you could get anywhere, like spaghetti carbonara or something, they're starting to really try to go back to their roots and find dishes that are a little more unique to the island. And I think it's fun to watch this happening because I think it's sort of like, well, we eat this kind of very specific kind of pasta preparation and noodle on this island, but that's just for us. And for the tourists, we give them the spaghetti carbonara or the spaghetti with tomato sauce. And now they're starting to realize, oh, actually, when people come here, they really want to try what we eat. And so it's been fun to watch some of these things get elevated a little bit more.
It's so funny when that happens because, I think the mentality is, oh, no one is going to care about this. We're just going to give them, pizza or, whatever dish that they're familiar with. And now, like you said, people are coming specifically to travel on their stomach and to, find these unique dishes. What are some of these dishes that you've enjoyed as you've been either island hopping or maybe in and around other parts of mainland Croatia?
Well, for example, there's a noodle that is called makaruli, which is very close to the word for macaroni, but it's not exactly like an Italian or an American macaroni. I think they're usually hand rolled, and it's kind of folded over. So it is a tube shaped pasta, but it's hand rolled, and that's an example of something that I don't remember seeing on too many menus at all, even 5 years ago, but certainly 10 years ago. That was not something that I was aware of. And I've noticed Korčula, Dubrovnik, in the southern part of Dalmatia especially, I start to see that on every menu. And the preparation that they are pushing these days is šporky makaruli, which is dirty macaroni, basically, which sounds unappetizing, but it's actually really delicious. It's got like a beef stew, kind of a slow simmered beef stew made with red wine and usually seasoned with cinnamon. So it has a little bit of a different flavor to it. And they put that over the makaruli. And it's really delicious. So it's kind of fun. And it's also nice because I think I want people to travel not for that kind of generic international experience, standard experience, but I want people to travel and have access to something they can only have in that place. So again, it's really fun to see a dish like šporky makaruli becoming a little more embraced and kind of recognized. It's nice too, because I think it's part of a process of the people of Croatia taking pride in what's local, which hasn't always been the case. I think especially during the Yugoslav period, everything was collectivized and it was mass tourism and it was what food can we crank out. Here's another great example in the interior part of Croatia. Plitvice Lakes National Park, which if you know anything about Croatia, this is this beautiful national park with lakes and waterfalls. If you think a beautiful picture of waterfalls in Croatia, it's probably from Plitvice Lakes National Park. And it's deep in the interior of the country. And there was an old kind of hotel-run restaurant that always used to be kind of junky, and they've now renovated it, but kept it very rustic and traditional. And almost everything on the menu has lamb because that's a local specialty there. And it was really fun to kind of go in and, instead of opening the menu and seeing, lots of international dishes that were catering to people from all over the world. There's, the items that are special for that region, which is called lika. Especially for that region, were actually flagged on the menu with a special little symbol, and and most of them were lamb dishes, and people were clearly being pushed to the local choices, which is something again that never would have been the case years ago.
What about the wine? That's another thing that I love about Croatia. I remember from my visits to Croatia, especially in the Istrian Peninsula, the wine was very rustic, and I don't use that term as a pejorative at all. It just means, it wasn't as refined as some other wines that you might get. So the quality could be very good, but, you might get a little more tannins than you might in some other kinds of wines. What was your experience enjoying wines on this most recent trip? What was the quality like, Cameron?
I mean, I think the quality of Croatian wines is outstanding, and they're not very well known internationally because they just don't export very much, and just because they don't have that international brand or awareness. But I think actually, especially even just in the last, I'd been there maybe 3 or 4 years ago, and even in that time, I see the wine industry developing at an astonishing pace. I mean, again, going back 20 years, 30 years, during the Yugoslav period, a lot of wine production was collectivized, and so all of the kind of unique distinctions between different wines were mushed together, and it was all about kind of big industrial production. And
bulk wine.
This is something that's but it's taken a quarter century, but they've, slowly people are going back and reclaiming a family, either people going back to their own heritage, or sometimes people bringing in know-how from other parts of the world and deciding they want to build their winery in Croatia somewhere. So I had some amazing experiences with Croatian wines. There's a region just north of Dubrovnik, and it's this long, skinny peninsula called Pelješac. Pelješac is the name of it, and it's an hour and a half drive from Dubrovnik. And that has some of the best wines in Croatia. And I have a local contact in Dubrovnik who actually runs a wine bar there, and he took me on a day tour up to Pelješac. And we already had in our guidebook several great places there, and he took me to just as many new ones that were either new or new to him, or had kind of emerged and evolved since the last visit I was there. And I just was blown away at the quality of the wines, and also the care with which these vintners are approaching their craft. And some of them, there's one guy, and I'm sorry, I could look it up, but I forget the name of it. But one guy, he's really an academic. He went and studied wine production, and he makes great wines, but he's kind of gone back to some heritage wines. Like there's a kind of wine that basically hasn't been made in Croatia in hundreds of years. And he kind of tracked down through genetics, the original grapes that were used for this wine. And he's planted some of these grapes, figured out a way to track down something that's very similar, or even with hybridization, he's created some, not new, but kind of trying to recreate some old vines. And some of the stuff he's doing is just really exciting.
That is so cool. I love when they try to resurrect some of whether it's a heritage vegetable or whether it's one of these old grapes that has pretty much been forgotten for forever, because either it's hard to grow or, it's fallen out of favor for whatever reason. So I'm really happy to hear this. And the other thing that I noticed when you're telling me that story, Cameron, is how jonesed you get when you discover a new place. That must be like uncovering a little diamond for you when you find a place that you're not going back to a place and just saying, okay, check mark, this place is still good. This is a brand new place for you. That must be awesome.
Yeah, it's a really fun and satisfying part of my work. And you're right. A lot of what I'm doing, some trips I go and I'm actually writing a new guidebook. So it's all new scouting. And that's, in some ways it's more work, but it's also more fun. But most of my trips are updating. So, 80% of my time, 90% of my time is spent just checking what's there. But I'm always on the lookout for new discoveries. And this is a case where I had a little extra time in Dubrovnik, and I said, I could take a day at the beach, or I could go out with this friend of mine, Sasha, and he could take me to some interesting new wineries and make these discoveries. And it's really gratifying for me because I find a place like these many wineries that I'm going to be putting in the book for next year. And then for years to come, it's very satisfying knowing a lot of travelers who otherwise wouldn't have thought to go there or wouldn't have known where to go if they were in the region. I often get feedback, or I bump into people who are using my book, and knowing that it'll have that concrete, sort of that tangible of a impact on people's trips is extremely gratifying. It's worth all the hard work easily, because I know how many people are going to discover this place thanks to that work. And the people who are recommended in the book, these vintners who deserve a little more attention, are going to get a little more attention now. And that's also, they work hard, and they deserve a bigger customer base, a little more attention than they've been getting. And so it's fun to be a part of that equation too.
Before we leave Croatia, I did want to talk a little bit about Dubrovnik itself, because it's been kind of held up as the poster child for over-tourism for a lot of different reasons. You just came back from Dubrovnik. You wrote the guidebook. So I'm going to ask you, Cameron, what are your tips for folks who are actually thinking of going to Dubrovnik, who have it on their bucket list, to maybe get the most out of it, but, not be elbow to elbow with all of humanity the whole time?
And that's a good question. And you're exactly right. Dubrovnik is one of the, if you listed 5 towns that are kind of becoming notorious for over-tourism, I think Dubrovnik's on the list. Most of the tourists, there's a couple of things. It's very crowded in July and August because you get people, other Europeans especially, coming in the summer for like a beach break. And then it's the cruise ships. Now, the good news is Dubrovnik, starting a few years ago, is they had no regulation of cruise ships for a while, or no limit to cruise ships. There was regulation. But I had a local tour guide who just told me that she remembers the worst day ever was, 6 or 7 years ago. And she said, I think there were 9 cruise ships in Dubrovnik on the same day.
Oh, my God.
This was just not sustainable. So the good news is they are limiting the number of cruise ships that can come on any given day. And they published the schedule of when those cruise ships are coming, that from day to day how many ships are coming and where they're coming from and so forth. So I guess one tip is, if you're going to be there at a time when there's a lot of cruising going on, check the website. And if there's a day where you can see there's 5 ships on this day and only 1 ship the next day, well, the day that there's 5 ships is a good day to get out of town. It's a good day to do a day trip or go to the beach, because a lot of the people on those ships, they're just going to take the bus right into town, and they're going to be in all the same sites right downtown and all the same restaurants that you'll be doing kind of if you're spending the night. But it's all concentrated in about a 4 or 5 hour period. And then as soon as the ship leaves, you got the place to yourself. So I would say be strategic about knowing when the days are going to be the most crowded and avoiding the main old town areas during that time. And I mentioned earlier, July and August is busy, and cruises can be anytime. But for Dubrovnik in particular, I think going a little farther off season is not a bad plan. In some of the smaller islands, I mentioned Far and Korčula, smaller islands do tend to shut down in the off season. So if you go to Korčula at the end of October, or middle of October even, you're going to find a lot of restaurants are closed and hotels are closed. If you go to Dubrovnik during those times, you generally have pretty good weather, and they are a lot less crowded. So I was in Dubrovnik. I think I landed in Dubrovnik on October 1st or something, and it was perfect. I was there for about a week. It was still really warm and sunny and clear. It was far less crowded than it would have been even 2 or 3 weeks earlier. My birthday is October 7th, and I did take the day off that day, and I actually went swimming in the Adriatic in Dubrovnik on October 7th.
Oh, nice.
A little bit after that, even a couple days after that, it started to cool off a little bit. But I would say push the edges of the season, especially if you're only going to Dubrovnik or Split, another big city. If you're going to the islands, you don't want to get too far off season, but I think even a couple of weeks can make a really big difference.
Let's head south a little bit out of Croatia, but stay within the former Yugoslavia. Montenegro is a country that's gaining popularity, but it's still unknown to a lot of North Americans. And I was just wondering, you went down there. Kotor is a place I really want to go. Tell me a little bit about Kotor and make the case for Montenegro.
Montenegro is, kind of an underrated destination. And what you might not realize, unless you look carefully at a map, is it's very close to the southern tip of Croatia. Of course, it borders Croatia, but from Dubrovnik, you can be at the Montenegrin border in about an hour and a half. You can be crossing into Montenegro. And so the way, you could certainly go and spend several nights or a night or two in Montenegro, but you can do it in a pretty satisfying way, even as a long day trip from Dubrovnik, especially if you get a bit of an early start. So this most beautiful part of Montenegro, I think if you're going anywhere in Montenegro for a short visit, it would be this gorgeous Bay of Kotor, Kotor, Kotor. And this is just this huge kind of, it's like a fjord-like inlet. And there are limestone mountains that just go straight up out of the ocean. It's extremely dramatic scenery. And there's a road that runs right along the water. Literally, the shoulder is the is the Adriatic Sea, that takes you all the way around. So from Dubrovnik to the main town on that fjord, the town of Kotor itself, is about 2.5 hours. If you don't have a long wait at the border, it could be 3 hours, a little more. So that's 3 hours to Kotor, and then there's a way you can come back on a loop, a slightly different way for at least part of the way. So you see some different scenery. That's a very popular day trip from Dubrovnik. I will say you're crossing the border into Montenegro. It can be backed up, especially at busy times. And, this coming January, Croatia is getting the euro currency, and they're also joining the Schengen open border zone. So I will say, if you're traveling in 2023, Montenegro and Croatia will now be the border between the EU, the Schengen zone, and the non-Schengen countries. So they're a little worried that there could be some even more substantial border delays than usual next year, because it's now kind of the outer border of the European open border zone. But if you have a lot of people like to hire a private driver for this trip. And in my guidebook, I recommend several of these drivers where you pay somebody, 250, 300 euros, which sounds like a lot, but they can take up to 4 people in their car. They say, hey, meet me at 7:30 outside the main gate of the old town of Dubrovnik. And you hop in their car, and they just take care of all the driving, and they know how to pace it, and they know the secret secondary border that might be less crowded, and they'll take you to maybe a spot for a good lunch or dinner. And it can be a very satisfying day out.
Yeah, we've hired drivers before, and it's always a good idea to have another couple to go with and split the expense, because it can be expensive, but it's money well spent if they're getting you through the border quickly and easily. You've been to Montenegro several times, but this time you were finally able to check something off your personal bucket list. Tell me about visiting Lovćen Mountain. Is that
Lovćen? Yeah.
Lovćen Mountain.
Lovćen. Yeah, this was a fun, you asked about how I, balance going back to places and just sort of just updating versus new discoveries. And this was a great example of something I've always wanted to see. And I've been to Montenegro, 8 or 10 times. And I managed to make it there through updating my guidebook every, 2 or 3 years. And for at least the last 10 or 12 years, every time I go to Montenegro, usually on a day trip from Dubrovnik, I say, if I have time and if I have perfect weather, I'm going to go up to this mountaintop called Lovćen, which is high above the Bay of Kotor that I just described. It's basically a mausoleum that was built for this great Montenegrin king, Petar Njegoš, and it was decorated with beautiful, beautiful statues by a Croatian sculptor that I'm sort of obsessed with, named Ivan Meštrović. If you've been traveled around Croatia at all, you see these giant statues of historical figures all over Croatian cities and towns. Those are usually by Ivan Meštrović, a really talented early 20th century sculptor. And anyway, he decorated this mausoleum. And the cool thing about Lovćen is it's on the top of the mountain. And because Montenegro is a very mountainous country, you're kind of on one of the higher points, at least in this part of the country. And you can see, I don't know statistically what it is, but it's something like a third of the entire country of Montenegro.
Oh,
Plus,
wow.
You can see all the way to Croatia. You can see all the way to Bosnia. You can see all the way to, I think you might be able to see a little bit of Albania even. And so it's this incredible viewpoint. Yeah. So on this trip, I had a driver that gave me some time that day, and he drove me in, and we did all of our guidebook updating tasks. And we were finished in Kotor about 4 p.m. And I said, well, I can either go back to Dubrovnik and be back in time for dinner, or come this far. The weather was absolutely flawless.
Do it.
I said to the guy, would you be willing to do this for me? And he said, yeah, that sounds like a fun adventure. And so we hopped in the car, and it was from Kotor. I think it was a good hour and a half or longer. And I mean, basically straight up, twisty roads, switchback roads, straight up. And then you get to the parking lot. And I actually didn't know this until I got there, but there's a tunnel with 300 stairs you have to walk to get up to the top. I didn't realize there'd be that much of a climb, but man, it was so worthwhile, because I got up there, and it was crystal clear, and I could see, into 4 different countries, and I could see all the way to the capital of Montenegro, Podgorica, which by car is like, an hour and a half, 2-hour drive from where I was. And it was just a stunning evening, and I was there just in time for the sunset. And it's one of those things, I think, one of you asked how things are different here after the pandemic. And I think I was maybe getting a little jaded in 2019 of just kind of, getting in a rut and just focusing on my guidebook assignments and so forth. And I really committed myself this year. I really want to sort of slow down, appreciate things. Like every day, I want to take several moments to just count my blessings that, it's an incredible privilege to be able to travel. And I think we all know this, especially after the pandemic when we couldn't. And so I've decided I'm going to sort of take these opportunities while I have them. And I didn't regret. We got back to Dubrovnik, at 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. It's pitch black most of the way. But it was totally worth it because I got to check this amazing experience off my bucket list.
Before I let you go, Cameron, you spent this past summer or part of this past summer in Scotland. And on social media, you made some comments about the famous Loch Ness, and some folks got upset by this. Tell me a little bit about that story. What went down?
Of all the things I didn't expect this year, this is a year of expect the unexpected. I did not expect to become a part of the Scottish tabloid news cycle for a couple of days this summer. But yeah, basically, I spent 3 weeks driving around all of Scotland, updating our guidebook for the first time in a few years post-pandemic. And I love Scotland. I adore Scotland. I've worked on that book before many times, and I know it well. And I love almost everything in Scotland. But I have to tell you, I was about halfway through the trip, and I drove past Loch Ness on my way to my next stop. And we have it in our book, and we give a little bit of it's famous. Everyone stops because they think they're going to see the monster, and here's what you can do. And I thought, well, I'll stop off and see how I feel about it. And I got to tell you, I got to. If you've been to Scotland, to this area, I think Scotland has a lot of really beautiful and really authentic pieces of its cultural heritage that it really has a gift for celebrating and making accessible to travelers. And I think I was in the zone of just feeling really excited about all the deep cultural experiences I was having in Scotland. But you come to Loch Ness, and I think something just snapped inside of me because the area. Now I should make this clear because I got a lot of feedback about this. There are parts of Loch Ness that are very beautiful, especially if you go on the opposite side from where the main highway runs and other parts. And if you have a lot of time to spend, I'm sure you could find some gorgeous little areas on Loch Ness. Unfortunately, the thing that tourists see, and frankly, the thing that the local tourist industry pushes people towards, is this little corner of this giant loch that's extremely overdeveloped with the tackiest kind of tourism you can imagine. And, really kind of crass, almost gross gift shops selling everything you can imagine, not just for the Loch Ness monster, but for, the worst version of Scotland, basically. And I just got really frustrated because, I feel like I'm somebody who really respects and values authentic pockets of local culture and traditions. And this just felt to me like the opposite of that. So on the rest of the drive across the middle of Scotland, I kind of composed this little Facebook or blog post in my imagination of, kind of a tongue-in-cheek takedown of Loch Ness from a tourist perspective. I used to love reading Roger Ebert's movie reviews, and he had a whole book of his most negative reviews. It was called "I hated this movie." A whole book of him basically taking down movies that made him crazy. And it's sort of like that. Like, he loves movies, but if it's a bad movie, he really hates it. I think because of how much he loves the rest of cinema, right? And that's kind of how I felt about this. It's like, I love travel, I love Scotland, but this is like the worst version of tourism and the worst version of Scotland. So I got to my destination, and that night I just rattled off this kind of lengthy rant on my Facebook page. Just first of all, outlining what I thought, sort of with great exaggeration, what I thought kind of the things I didn't like about Loch Ness. But I also said and this is what I really believe, part of what bothered me about it is I saw how many people were there. And I had just spent a couple of days in the area around Inverness, which is 45 minutes away. And I'd been to so many more beautiful, interesting, engaging, authentic cultural experiences that were even closer to Inverness than Loch Ness is, that had nowhere near the number of people I saw at Loch Ness. And so the whole point of my post was, first of all, to tee off on Loch Ness, but it was also to say, hey, if you're planning a trip, here are some things. If you have a half day to spend, don't go on a lake cruise on Loch Ness thinking you're going to see an imaginary monster. Like, spend that time, for example, going to a sheepdog show where you can watch a trained sheepdog actually herd sheep in the middle of a Scottish farmland,
Right.
Or go to Culloden Battlefield, which is the most important historic site in Scotland and has a beautiful story to tell. Go to a pub in Inverness and listen to some traditional folk music. There's so much more to do that tells you more about Scotland. And anyway, so I posted this thing and forgot about it. And I woke up the next morning and I'd gotten a really good response from travelers because I think they look to me and count on me for giving them good advice about how to best spend their time. But at some point, I started getting all these nasty comments from Scottish people who said, "How dare you come to our country and besmirch this beautiful loch?" And that's what I realized that a tabloid had picked it up. A Glasgow tabloid had picked up this blog post. With everything going on in the world in 2022, I still don't understand why a newspaper is trolling my Facebook social media presence for a news story. I still can't figure out why someone thought this was worth elevating, because it was never intended for Scottish people. I didn't even do it as I was accused later of it was a publicity stunt. I had no interest in that publicity, but it got picked up actually by 5 or 6 other tabloids. And I screenshotted all the headlines, but it was, there was for about 2 days, every crappy newspaper in the northern part of Great Britain had headlines like "American travel writer, dares to insult the beautiful Loch Ness" or something like that.
Oh my goodness.
It was a very surreal experience. And I knew it was a big deal when someone from BBC Scotland reached out to me and said, "Would you like to come on our primetime news show
and defend yourself?"
Their version of 2020 to, how did they put it? To elaborate on your thoughts on Loch Ness. I actually said no. And, I'm not, it's as evidence that I wasn't seeking. I mean, what would I be publicizing? I'm not publicizing an American guidebook for a Scottish audience. I will say the regret I had about it was that of course, I painted with a broad brush because it was satire. And of course, somebody who really loved Loch Ness and who knows it beyond that kind of touristy fringe had every right to be offended. And I reached out to a few of them who commented on my Facebook page and actually had some nice conversations with them. Like, yeah, you're right. Someday I should come back and spend a little more time and see more than what's there. But in my defense, if you go to Loch Ness area, everything is just steering you. All of the tourist industry is steering you to this one junky little stretch, this kind of gauntlet of garbage. And, I think I thought a lot later about why did this trigger me so much? And I think the fact is we couldn't travel for 2 years, and that was really hard. I travel 3 or 4 months a year, and I have for more than 20 years, and I take great pride in it. It's not just my work; it's my passion. And when I couldn't travel for those 2 years, I took actually some time off work, and I wrote a memoir about my experiences as a travel writer called "The Temporary European." And in that book, I kind of relived some of my favorite stories, and I've sort of pledged in sort of the epilogue to that book that when I could get back to travel, I was going to make sure I not just continued to travel in a positive way, but I was going to really challenge myself to seek out real, true, authentic experiences and really fully appreciate them. And I think it was when I came into Loch Ness, to this particular part of Loch Ness, I think it made me crazy because it was sort of, a lot of us are saying after the pandemic, have we learned nothing? And that's kind of how I felt when I came into this little village. I was like, have we learned nothing? Like we all said during the pandemic, I promise when I get, at least I did, when we get back to travel, I'm going to do it better, and here's the worst version of tourism in Scotland is thriving bigger than ever before. And it just made me crazy. There's so much better things that you can see and do with your time in Scotland. And it just deeply offended me that this was attracting so many otherwise smart travelers to waste their time and their money. So I stand by it. I feel bad of the toes I stepped on. And I think there's certainly a lot to be said for other aspects of Loch Ness. But in terms of the way it's marketed by the local tourism industry, it's really a shame. I think it's a missed opportunity.
2 thoughts come to mind as you're telling me this fantastic story, Cameron. First is that one of the things that I like about you and the guidebooks that you write is that you guys are fair umpires. You call balls and strikes, and you call them like you see them. And it's not, based on what the tourism board is saying or, what is the most popular thing on TripAdvisor. It's, really looking at this. Is this a worthwhile activity? Because people have limited amount of time and money. And, if they're spending a bunch of time at Loch Ness, they're not able to spend it somewhere else. So that's the first thing, and I really appreciate that. And the second thing is, I'm so glad you mentioned Roger Ebert, because he's a fellow University of Illinois alum, and he worked at the newspaper, obviously long before I did, but I worked at the radio station there. So I'm always happy to hear University of Illinois alum getting some props, and obviously I'm a big Roger Ebert fan, so thanks for that too.
Yeah, I actually was thinking of him as I was, because also I'm traveling for these long periods, and to be honest, part of it was it's sometimes you just need to entertain yourself. And I always used to love reading his reviews where he would take down a poorly made movie. And frankly, I was probably also just a little bored, and this was sort of an entertaining thing. But, when Roger Ebert takes down a movie, it's not intended as an insult for all the people who worked on the movie. He knows that a lot of effort went into it, and that there's a lot of talented people who really threw themselves into it. But the fact is it didn't work, and it wasn't successful at what it was trying to do. And sometimes I think he would get really mad when something was just done lazily or thoughtlessly. And I think that was the same response I had. These people who run B&Bs on Loch Ness wrote to me and said, "How dare you? This is my livelihood." And I said, "Yeah, I feel bad for you, because you're working hard and trying to provide people with a good value. But the fact is the local tourist board posted to sort of, I think they were trying to sort of piggyback on this publicity that I'd created that I didn't even want, but they posted and kind of said, how dare you, make fun of Loch Ness? Don't you realize we were just recently featured as on a list of the top 10 most Instagrammable sites in Europe?" It's like, I wanted to say, well, you made my point.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
If you want to travel based on what's Instagrammable, have at it. But from my point of view, that can be good travel, but that's not necessarily good travel. And this is a case where for me, that Venn diagram doesn't overlap.
Well, Cameron Hewitt, thank you so much for being on the Destination Eat Drink podcast. It's so great to have you back talking about Montenegro and Croatia and even Loch Ness, and wish you a lot more happy travels and big success in the future. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you so much, Brent. It's been great being back, and I wish you and your audience very happy travels going forward.
Okay, there you go. What a fun conversation that was with Cameron Hewitt. I just love that Loch Ness monster kerfuffle story. It was just great. I've got a link to Cameron's social media as well as a link to his book, The Temporary European, in the show notes at radiomisfits.com/DED220. Well, that's it for this week. Next week, we are in Seattle for a new taco invention and a genius way to eat cupcakes, so don't miss that. Until then, DestinationEatDrink.com is open for business. I just posted a story about a delicious Spanish dish that's sweet and savory from Andalusia. Get that at DestinationEatDrink.com/eggplant. And if you enjoyed the show, please rate and review us on your podcast app, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever. We're on all of them. I would appreciate your 5-star rating. Thank you so very, very much. Destination Eat Drink is distributed by the Radio Misfits Podcast Network and a guy who's in trouble with the Chicago Tourism Board for putting ketchup on his hot dog, Ed Silla. Thanks, Ed. I'm Brent Peterson. I'll see you down the road.
Join us next week for another culinary adventure on Destination Eat Drink, a presentation of the Radio Misfits Podcast Network.